we could look at your article. We could also look at the map that you kind of pre-populated and stuff. All right, and it looks like we're live. So
your article.
oh no, David,
We could also look at the map that you kind of
mute that
pre-populated and
stuff.
stuff. All right.
All
It looks
right,
like we're live. So your article.
or is that me? I think I might have done a thing. Oh nope, it was us. All right, we're good. Okay, live streaming is fun for everyone because we audio loop back and things like that. So hello everyone. I just sneezed all over. It's great. What a way to start a show. We're gonna do some discussion on design systems today, and to kind of engage with that, we've brought some awesome people with us. We've got George, we've got Tom, and of course we have David. And I think we've put links to everyone's social profiles and things like that in the description of the stream. So if you want to check that out, you can do that in the meantime. This is going to be a fun one, and I'm going to tee us up. I'm going to start with George. George, you proposed exploring design systems with Wardley mapping, and you've also been doing some work in that regard. What inspired you to sort of explore that angle of things? Like, why do you even care about design systems? Give us a little bit of the background here.
Good question. Thanks, Ben, and hi everyone. I joined the design systems team about a month and a half ago at Zero, and that's something that I haven't worked on before. I've previously worked on e-commerce websites or APIs. So design system was like, what is that? I don't even know where to take it, so that's where that came from. I wanted to kind of, and I thought of Wardley mapping as a way to kind of unpack any kind of system and see where it might be taken or where parts of it can be taken. And so that was the perfect segue into Wardley mapping.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, Wardley mapping forces you to define things like the language, like the words, the parts, how it all connects together into a whole. I mean, so it's really good for exploring just about any concept, just to sort of, even for yourself, get your own thoughts on the page. How does this thing really work? What does it really do? And then, so I think you tweeted something about that, and I was like, yeah, that sounds like a great kind of interesting idea to explore. And then Tom was like, I need to get in on this too. So Tom, tell us a little bit about kind of like tee us up. What brought you into this sort of picture, and why you were interested in design systems?
Why I'm interested in design systems? I'm a product designer. So I'm currently director of product design with a company called Apploy. Like most companies, we have a sort of a fledgling design system. Like most companies, it is very, very fledgling. And I think when you look at design systems in general, this is something I've been thinking about for many years as they've been around. They're not one thing. There's a whole host of meanings when people talk about design systems, and there's a whole host of different ways that people try to use them. I've also been trying to do my own Wardley mapping of different design activities and how design activities and design as a practice changes during the different stages of evolution. So I was interested to join in this conversation and see what others think.
Excellent, yeah. And David, also, you have a background in design. And when you hear design systems, like, what kind of things does that bring to mind? Like, what's your angle on this as well?
What does it bring to mind? So many things. Yeah, I have a background in design, product design, UX design. So I think when I was doing most of that work, design systems were not super well established. Like, I know Gina had been doing a lot of the early stuff, I think with Salesforce. And she had been running her conference. I'm forgetting the name of it exactly right now. But if you're a design patterns person, you probably know of the conference. So I've worked with it a little bit, especially early on. Like, George, you were saying you worked with APIs. I did also earlier in my career. And then basically the engineers that I worked with were like, we are tired of rebuilding the same components over and over again. Can we just use Bootstrap? And I was like, well, this is an enterprise app and Bootstrap doesn't exactly work amazingly for that. So maybe we need to do our own thing. So that's kind of where where I lived with design systems, and they've exploded and grown and are amazingly more complex and different now than when I was working with that stuff. So I'm really excited to hear from both of you how all that goes when you're actually trying to build it for an organization.
Awesome. Okay, so with that, I'm in the Miro board, and just in case you don't have a link, I'll throw that in the Zoom chat. But what we'll do is we'll kind of dig into. I think what we could start with is George's unfinished map. But here's the trick, I think, when it comes to especially a map that someone has spent a lot of time like working on, where it's kind of developed to the point where there's lots of moving parts, there's lots of kinds of assumptions and basically decisions made in the process of making the map. And what I want to suggest we do is one of the tricks that I think for bringing people up to speed is actually recreating the map from scratch. And so, George, I'm going to propose, and you can tell me if this will work or not work for you, but why don't you kind of keep like your map as the point of reference, and let's start over and bring the audience along, and what we can do as we go along is we'll actually like the reason I like doing the recreation version of this to bring other people up to speed on an existing map is because it's going to force us to like encounter all those decisions that you made along the way, at least the ones that we care about, and we might actually make different decisions along the way, but I think it's a good way of getting us up to speed. So I've got
100%.
a copy of the mapping canvas off to the side here, to the right of your map. So maybe just like walk us through your thinking process, how you got started. Like you used the mapping canvas that comes with Miro. Tell us about like how you started getting into making a map of this, why you were doing that, all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, like I said, I wanted to break it apart, and one of the things that Simon says in the beginning is that you anchor to the user and their needs. So that was quite key that I wanted to, and I didn't know what the needs were. So and I'm still learning about those things, and who the user is, more specifically within our context, but also perhaps I'm missing out on some, but that's probably a discussion for another day. So that's where I started at, just trying to define first the people who would be using it. Primarily, we think of the users as designers and primarily front end engineers who'd be consuming that information mostly. I'm not sure if in different organizations there are other kind of non-users, but sort of people who kind of know about design systems and think about them. Obviously, the design organization itself, but also the product people who kind of are on the ground, and they have to make the trade-offs between using components from the design system versus probing into something completely new and building some new onboarding experience that doesn't exist in the design system. So there's that kind of there's a kind of like a map that goes out. But at the core, I think it's designers and engineers who primarily would be using it. And so I tried to first, basically went through that whole exercise and mapped out what they would need in that process. And I remember you did the CI/CD video as well recently. And what I liked about it was that you kind of used the process of CI/CD as a way to kind of have a skeleton for structuring the needs and the things that would come under those things. So kind of try to follow the same pattern here. So I thought about like first they find out about the system, because they might not even know that it exists, and then they go somewhere and they discover it and they read about it, and then potentially they install some of the components from it, or potentially just the library itself first, and then try to play around with it, and all that good stuff. I'm not going to go into the whole process, but we can probably reconstruct it. And I'm curious to hear what Tom would say. It probably is a bit of a different flow to events for engineers and designers.
Yeah, let's get some contrast going then. So Tom, you've kind of heard what George is bringing in as like some assumptions around who a design system is for, who's going to use it, and kind of like a first pass at that user journey. Tell us a little bit about what's where you overlap with that perspective and where you might see some differences. Let's get some contrast to George's view of this.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what George is saying. I think that makes a lot of sense. And certainly when it comes to front-end engineers wanting to not have to rewrite lots of code all the time and have to do the same things over and over again, that makes sense. The designers often want to have components and things to look better all the time more easily. There are people who want to prototype quicker. That's another need. There's also, in general, I'd say that there's a need that the design system is, I think, in ideal circumstances helping, which is the organization's need to be able to work faster or most product organizations want to deliver more stuff. So that's kind of a design system. That's where the design system comes in handy. If you find that it is worth, I think, the effort that it takes to create and maintain one, that's a challenge.
That's interesting.
I also see there's a tension sometimes between the engineer's way of working and the designer's way of working.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that is very much a good point, because I think there are implications, right, around how designers think about design versus how implementers think about implementing, and like different priorities are going to be made, and like in isolation, to the extreme, those priorities can actually cause like harmful effects from the overall standpoint. And so there's like an integration and a negotiation happening here. That tension is like useful.
Absolutely, yeah.
As far as
there's another player actually there, which is the sort of brand side. So the
Oh,
people
yeah.
who care about the brand of the business and want to, install custom fonts that they've had hand designed and bring all the jazzy colors and animation into the products and things like that.
So like presenting consistent branding to the outside users of the organization. That makes sense. Okay, so there's some basics here that we've kind of got down. As far as that tension, is a design system about enforcing a standard, or is it about creating the space for a conversation about the way we should do things? I don't know anything about design systems, so I'll open the floor to that.
But you've just, I think, put your finger on exactly the biggest question about design systems. Are they being created in order to impose control, or in order to enable teams to work better, faster, etc.?
Yeah, it's a constant tension, definitely in that space, and it's quite difficult. It's almost like it's a philosophical question that may not be possible to resolve, almost, because you're almost moving along that moving between that and the fixed and the not fixed, and the more enabling and the more kind of and it's, I don't think we've solved it, certainly, and maybe it's not possible to solve.
Yeah, I suspect in its best form, it's more like scaffolding or enabling constraints. It limits some of what you could potentially do, so you can focus on a fewer things.
Yeah, totally.
And that's a little bit of like complexity language, right? Constraints reduce your options, right? And in some senses, you want I think the key distinction is governing constraints versus enabling constraints. And I'm gonna absolutely butcher that like description of things. So I don't know if Tom, you could give us kind of a quick like overview of what those differences are.
Oh God, off the top of my head.
Okay, or I could take a shot at it too. It's just that I'll definitely be wrong, and then maybe we could take see where we end up there. So if I'm thinking about constraints that are governing, in my view, are more about this imposing control idea, like extremely hard boundaries. And it contextually, like I'm thinking about evolution already, right? Like governing constraints sound to me like things you might see in commodity sort of things typically. Like if I'm thinking about safety, for example, lockout, key out procedures for machines where you're basically trying to prevent the machine from ever being operated while someone is performing maintenance on it. That seems to me like an absolute, like I'm going to impose control there because safety is the concern. and I know we're straying a little bit from design systems examples, but enabling constraints are a little different. Like maybe in the context of design systems, enabling constraints are about creating conditions where there are flexible boundaries that give you guides about how to make decisions. So maybe like a design system says, govern a constraint, use this font in the front end, but enabling constraint, always consider the tension between this customer and this kind of customer. You need to meet both their needs. I'm not going to tell you how to do that, but so I probably butchered that decision or butchered that definition, but like I'm curious where you'd fill in some of the gaps there. What kinds of things I've messed up there?
I think that sounded about right. Yeah, and that's exactly the sort of the way that I think it works. The other form of constraints that I think is interesting when it comes to design systems and pattern languages in general is the idea of scaffolding or exoskeletons versus endoskeletons, particularly. A lot of design systems that I've seen at least focus on the surface layer, and it's just the final result. You're going to see the shiny carapace of the product, but don't have much to say about the skeleton inside. And when you have this shiny carapace, that really is, I think, a limiting governing constraint. You're limiting what's possible. Whereas with an endoskeleton, something that's more internal and can flex a bit, you can get an enormous range of different evolution off the back of that. It's another way to think inside out, outside in.
In scaffolding and the endo exoskeleton things, it sounds like that's something that Dave Snowden has been playing with Cognitive Edge folks. At least I've seen some of the material around that. And
yeah,
not to get too distracted, but scaffolding is really interesting because of the basis of scaffolding. Like, how do we build these systems, these kind of like supporting structures that help us build the products that we're building, etc. The sort of like concrete foundations sometimes for those sorts of things are interesting, like the points of coherence, the things that we hold in common, the areas around which we can kind of organize around the common ground and things like that. But I am way out of my league of understanding with that. So what I'm going to suggest we do is, returning to George, kind of walk us through where you went next. Like, we've got some needs, some of the basic journey that you described before. So finding out about the system, reading about it, playing with it. That's very tactical, like engagement with a design system from the standpoint of its use. From the standpoint of like how an organization is deploying a design system, let's zoom out a little bit and kind of look at the longer kind of time span implications. What is a design system doing for the organization?
Yeah, well, so what Tom's alluded to is it's the company is usually growing and at that scale where they have multiple teams doing multiple things and multiple products. So you can imagine the complexity that grows out of that. And so if the one team is building an onboarding experience or any kind of experience with their own tools, and then the other team is doing something else with sort of the same stuff. It's all the same components usually. We click on buttons, we have forms, we have tables, we have nav bars, footers, all that kind of stuff. So at some point the decision was made to bring it all together, and that's where the design system basically enables then a team to just download the library. Don't use some kind of odd button that you've made before. Just pull the button from the design system that said job is done. It's got all the stuff that you need there. It's got colors, typography, all of the stuff. You don't need to change it, and preferably you don't change it as much as possible. Just go with it. You've got a button, move ahead to something that's more challenging. Don't think about that base level stuff. Yeah. That's the key promise, I guess, of a design system.
That makes sense. So if I'm thinking about this from the standpoint of the map, like in general, it seems like in any system, right? You've got a range of components that are sort of falling across this evolution, and so say things that are more fundamental and invisible, like power, like compute, like network, like the fact that you have internet browsers deployed on all these computers and they all conform to greater or lesser degrees to some internet standards. That W3C comes to mind, if I'm remembering the acronyms correctly. And then like on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you've got weird stuff that nobody's ever seen before that are kind of internal gambles. And then there's kind of like the core value proposition that's being deployed into customers' hands right now that is already working, right? And of course, there's kind of like the spectrum here, like totally novel innovation, potential ROI, found value, that kind of stuff in custom built, and then just the feature wars, if you will. Like, oh, we've got to keep pace with everyone and so on. So you got this like range of activities and range of places that those things can be. A design system is kind of playing in all of these, I think. Is that true, or what do you think?
Yeah. Tough one. Yeah, because I don't think it plays. I've always thought of it as it plays more in it tries to play in the commodity space as much as possible, because at least at the component side, because you want to think of a component as like a package thing that you don't have to worry about too much. It's locked in. You don't want to play around with it too much. But then there's other like more abstractions at the higher level where it's like onboarding patterns, or like any kind of patterns with different components, how you want to, and that is used more in the early stages where teams are exploring how to actually say they're building a new product. Perhaps they're not trying out a new onboarding flow at the same time, but they're definitely thinking in that space more like, what do we need to do here, as opposed to like we know what needs to be done.
Got it.
So I think that there are some parts that grow out of the basic components that start to play in the early stages. And we actually, one of the things that we currently try to solve is how to also get people to contribute to the system without, with it being kind of fitting into the system, but they're bringing this stuff from their world, which we can't see because we can't be everywhere to see what works in this particular product or this particular flow. So we're trying to, blend those things together. That's part of the reason why I wrote that article, is to how to bridge that gap between us, where we sit in kind of like more product commodity land, what at least we hope to be, and then how to bring the teams that are at the edges coming up with new stuff. And it happens quite often. They'll say, "Oh, we sold this onboarding flow with this new pattern, and we want to. How possible is it to bring it over to your design system?" We're like, "Well, hold on a second. We need to have a look, pat it out, just feel it out. What's working, what's not, what's common, what's not." So there's definitely that, but I feel like it's currently more brought from outside, the stuff at the genesis and the early stages, and we're kind of sitting more on the commodity side.
Yeah, and Tristan brings up an interesting point. Like, would a design system be like a marketplace or an innovate, leverage, commoditize pattern? Which innovate, leverage, commoditize is a particular strategic play in the Wardley like vocabulary, where you basically provide something in commodity out to the broader world, or if you have a big enough organization, out to the broader organization. The organization builds stuff with it, and then over time, some of those projects will succeed, some of them will fail. And if you start to see something of value emerging, then you can say, okay, we want to bring that into our actual like platform of sorts. So if something actually evolves and becomes successful, it's like, that is valuable, let's actually bring it into the platform and make it part. Now you have two things, right? So and then that kind of cycle repeats. And with Amazon as an example, like, this is something they do with an external customer ecosystem where they monitor metadata along here in order to find out what's valuable. In this case, it's a little bit different, right? Because hypothetically, if you're inside the same walls, metaphorically speaking, as an organization, like you are aligned, at least in some basic sense, of what kind of features you're trying to bring about. Maybe you're not aligned in terms of how well you act towards those features, but in general, like, you've got the two ways of thinking about this, right? You have a design system and you deploy it into the organization so that you force everyone to use it. You're looking at what I think would be more of an internal ecosystemic view, which is, hey, let's provide this thing to the network and see what they do with it. And when they start doing interesting things, we have a moment where we have a conversation of, hey, it seems like you found something of value. Let's see what we can do to bring it into the actual design system so other people can use it. And that increases the value. Yeah, Tom.
Well, I was wondering if a design system is sort of a pipeline for moving components from Genesis through to commodity and stabilizing things. And then I'm thinking, with that innovate, exploit, commoditize, whatever you said, leverage, commoditize, pattern. No, it's gone. With that pattern, what granularity could you work at? Do you need the entire design system to be stood up and fully evolved before you can start to leverage it? Or can you take some smaller subsection of it and start to work with that? If the developer just has, in the extreme, one form field that is for entering email addresses, only now you don't have to keep rewriting the validation all the time, and it just has the absolute rock solid form field that's the best thing we've ever created. And all we ever do when we need that email address form field is go to the design system, grab it and stick it in.
The pipeline idea makes a lot of sense. It's like tending to the system. It's a meta thing. It's an enabler. I'm saying words and like something clicked in my head and I don't know how to verbalize it, but like suddenly it makes sense to me in a new way. So yeah, I think that's a thread we need to pull. And in order to pull it further, George, I know like you've got some of the parts already defined. Like if I sneak a peek at your pre-existing map over here, you've got all sorts of stuff that you're playing with. Let's get some of those parts on the map. And maybe we can, once we have the words for the parts, like what is a design system made of, that might help us get more into how it enables a pipeline, how it functions, all this kind of fun stuff. So yeah, I'll turn it over to you, George.
Yeah, thank you. I try to denature it from our particular business, but I don't know if it's common or not to all design systems. But usually it starts with some kind of introductory guide to the system itself, usually in the form of some kind of website, which I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but probably needs a CMS. But anyway, it starts with a guide, and then obviously that requires that it would have a design system like library to be consumed. Library can be many things, but primarily, well, for us in our particular case, it's a React library. So that means that it also needs React to function. There's also some CSS rules, which are kind of I think it's partially like legacy code, which we had used before, and so but that's still in the play. So one thing that's very confusing for me in the first in the early days of a design system is that, and I don't know if it's common. Be curious to hear about Tom's experience, but for us, because we use some semantic versioning, it's you kind of have to think of a design system not as the design system, but it's like version 1, version 2, version 3. All of them have actually different things, so they're almost like different products sometimes, especially if there's a big jump between one and to the other. And so, but you also have to, and of course, we're trying to maintain so that we don't support all the old versions. We just support like the latest 2, but you still have those old versions and people use them. So you kind of have to think of them as like they exist out there. So anyway, a bit of an aside. Obviously, it needs somewhere to store that code. So probably precludes GitHub, or well, in our case, it is GitHub. I don't know if you want me to go kind of like horizontally or dive deep into what I've mapped, because then it starts to kind of move into more design land with like the Figma library, the way to test the component with Storybook. I mean, probably other tools out there. So I don't know if we want to call them out as like Figma versus Sketch, for example, or maybe make it more abstract. And Storybook, again, I don't think it's the only tool out there. So. But yeah, so and obviously you need the code editor, some linting, and then further down on the side, there's how do you deploy it and what do you need for deployment, and ultimately what you need for kind of tracking whether things are working. So there's stuff like New Relic, Docker, Cypress. These are all technologies. I don't know, again, if they should be abstracted out to be more kind of basic.
Yeah, it's interesting because that gets into a question of how broad does the design system go.
Yeah,
so I think I've seen design systems sold as it's literally just kind of a library in Figma. I would say that's not quite a design system, really. That's a style guide or something. But you're touching on the need for a like twin versions to be kept live there's a version in the material of the web itself, which is the code, but there's also a visible version that designers can play with in Figma or Sketch or something like that. And then if you're getting into Docker and how you then ship the stuff, I mean, that's interesting. That's beyond what I've sort of thought of before, but makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
I think
and
that
versioning, all the
sorry.
versioning stuff as well is starting to get complex when you have a lot of people playing in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we try to control that by just not at least not supporting the older versions. So you don't kind of like when someone says, "Well, this is not working in that version," the default is just upgrade to the new version and it'll be working. So it's not too much complexity, but you still have to like the code is still there, and you kind of have to think about it as like I guess maybe you don't have to think about it too much. You don't have to maintain it, so maybe that's not an issue as much. Yeah.
So
And,
getting into some of the abstraction questions around this. So I tried to do some on the fly abstraction as we were talking. So maybe double check me here to make sure that I haven't gone astray. So far, what we've described so far is at the top, you have a guide. So this is like a user interface for the design system. And an example instance of that might be a website. Although I imagine like if I'm thinking about like different kinds of design systems for different functions, like if you're building websites in your pipeline up top here and you're pushing those from left to right, or you're building a digital product, like, yeah, like maybe the guide is, a series of web documentation that you can use, because the things that will be inside the design systems are like code snippets and examples and like hexadecimal codes for colors and whatever, right? But if you're like designing refrigerators, I don't know, like that might look a little bit different. And so I think the concept of a design system can apply across these contexts, from digital products to physical products to literally, I think you could apply design systems to like government policy, for example. Like there's got to be like some common threads here across these different contexts. So then you've got your guide, you've got your website. Okay, and then zeroing in on that is underneath that is the design system library itself. So this is like, if the user interface is the website, the system library is what the designers working on the design system itself are designing. Sorry, there's just a lot of designing. So I heard you describe like React components, and React being a JavaScript framework, if I know things correctly, for front ends. I just know it was really hard for me to play with way back. But components are reusable, right? So you could have like if you had a time selector, for example, in a digital app, you could make a component that has all the right wiring for your instrumentation and for how you submit things to the back end, and like all like implementing the brand colors and stuff like that, and class systems for CSS and so on. Like that is a component that you want to be able to reuse all across the different product areas, whether it's the login form or if it's something for submitting a different kind of form elsewhere in the app. So you got your components, and then
you're touching on something there which we hadn't quite covered yet. I don't think you mentioned explicitly, George, which is like a data layer. How do you get it so the front end components really easily link up with the back end data system? Something like GraphQL, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we actually try not to touch that space because we feel like it's too complex. And out of even the talking to users, we've been told that basically, it would be great to have some like, please don't touch it in a way, because it would make it too difficult for us to actually re-engineer it if it's wrong. And it's high likelihood that it can be wrong. So let us play with it, and which kind of makes sense. Yeah, you don't want to dive into that complexity. So, but that's why I didn't touch on it. But it's possible that some design systems do go with that way. And who knows? Maybe we will at some point. We'll just say, hey, well, there's probably some level of that involvement we can take.
That seems like an important decision to make about what's in scope and what's out of scope for a design system. Like if I made a Wardley map of your entire application stack, then what would probably emerge is that there are multiple components with different people working on different parts of the system, and maybe design systems shouldn't be universal. Maybe they like some of them could be universal, like in a certain sense, like principles are a design system for decisions, right? But like if I zoom in on component by component like concerns, the decisions being made there are different, right? Just like the decisions made for building refrigerators is going to be different than those made for a user interface. So like multiple design systems are possible potentially. Like maybe there's no like one size fits all here. I don't know. Am I on the right
Well,
path there?
there's,
Yeah.
I mean, I've definitely seen where like design systems cover, like if thinking about like enterprise or like more B2B stuff, you'll need to consider marketing and then internal tools and products, because design systems for like a lot of consumer apps and products would be very different from enterprise, often because of just density of screens and products. And then this is where the language for me gets a little funny, where there's like guidelines versus systems versus components and all of this, because if you think about like a system for, so like you'll have your system for internal, for your employees. And then some companies have external systems as well. They're the same thing, but packaged differently. Like I'm thinking about like Apple's HIG or like material design. Like I don't know, but my general understanding is like material internal documentation is a lot more broad or a lot more deep than the external documentation. And just thinking about like, I have a little experience, not like just through friends, of like how Google works with some of their material stuff. It's like, I have no idea how many teams they even have. I can't even guess. But there are so many situations where their design system, like material stuff, doesn't apply for the product that certain teams build. And partly because it is like, is this like dev tools versus is this a consumer application? And so there's a lot of variations. And a team I used to work on is now part of Google, and they were building like API management software. So like a lot of that, there are no things that exist in material that quite work. But then like that team is trying to build their own like variation of material components that work for the stuff they do. Like you're
They
like,
did they sort of fork it and extend it, or?
I don't know the details, but that's kind of my guess, because like you're looking at interfaces that they're developing for like, well, if you're thinking about like API management stuff and something where someone's needing to monitor things and they're building for mobile, and like you might have like a decision tree of like 30 different options for like monitoring one API call. Like that's not going to work with like bootstrapped components. I know like mixing companies, but you got a lot of like really different variables there. Whereas like a company, like when I was working on like a smaller design system, I think we had like 30 folks on the dev team and like 4 designers. So like that was a pretty like, it was big enough, but it was pretty small as like what were the core components and things like that. So like I think the decisions you need to make really vary by size of org and what kind of things you're building too.
That makes a lot of sense. While you were saying that, I'm enjoying abstracting it away from the context that we know best. And like Ben's question, what about a design system for refrigerators or public policy or houses? And then I was thinking there's one article I remember vividly, which is our design system is a conversation. And it literally just had a meeting every week and talked about what they were doing. And that was it.
Yeah, there's definitely many versions of that. I think Spotify may have probed into branching so many their design system. They kind of have an umbrella name for it. I can't remember what the name is, but they basically said we have so many teams, and the Spotify is buying so many different businesses that have to be rolled into it. It's impossible for one system to kind of cater to it all, so they kind of just split it all out. Can't remember to how many parts, and it's all internal as well. So it's not even the external versus internal. It's all internal. So the scale matters quite a bit. For us, I don't know if we're ready to branch out. We do have a mobile design system as well, which might be different, but I think we're trying to link it with tokens, which is another concept which we can probably talk about, because that's where you kind of try to abstract the core rules from the code itself, or it's still in code, but it's more abstracted so it can be consumed by other systems, not necessarily the same system. We have it there. You've been mapping quietly, Ben.
So tell me about tokens. This is new to me.
Yeah, so actually it is a bit new to me because I've not encountered them physically sort of, but my understanding is that it would be still rules written in code, but they would be, so say you've got a variable in CSS that has that codifies the colors to be used in the app, right? So that is now taken out of the CSS. So you don't need CSS as much, or you don't need to consume that particular CSS with that preprocessor, for example. And so, but you can use the same rules. You can codify those rules in such an abstract way that it can be consumed by, an iOS app, maybe something else. Well, I actually don't know what else could be consuming it, but it's definitely, it pulls it out of the core a little bit further up. But again, I've not seen it actually. What does that look like? But I'm guessing it's just some document with some text in it, with some rules in it. That's as basic as I can get.
Got it. So like an extremely basic codification of like the primary brand color is off blue or something, and then a pipeline that takes that and deploys it into the actual like CSS files or like so on for each different kind of project. Maybe is that roughly? That
would be understanding. Yes, yeah.
Okay.
The pipeline definitely plays into it because you basically need to have a different way, have a different track for it to kind of reach different products.
Okay.
Makes sense. There's a lot about how much abstraction is what I'm picking up from, but the same questions come out fractally, it seems.
Yeah, and it's also about kind of like enabling the scale, so that people don't have to like focus on just having a like say a CSS file, but they can actually take it to a different system and use it there without having to without creating any tech debt in the future. They don't have to like copy the CSS rules into their files and then hope that they don't change. They know that they won't change because that stays the same.
A lot of this seems to be about managing variety, and I'm kind of curious when it comes to a design system. There seems to be like a threshold at which the scale is sufficient enough to justify basically the the investment in the meta process for how things get designed. Is that like minimum usefulness when there are 2 projects, or is it like more like when there are 10, or is it dependent?
Good question. Somewhere between those 2 numbers, I think. Two is probably a bit low.
I think that's just a conversation instead of a design system.
Yeah, because I think if you can just get together regularly and share files, and then that's much lower overhead than working on design systems and creating these structures.
That's fair. That makes me want to break this. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Although I think there is some value, maybe more on the engineering side of things. Like, even if you're working on 2 different teams on 2 different products or like related, reducing the amount of redundant code for interface is also super helpful. Because I've definitely been part of conversations of like, why did we recode like form fields?
Yes,
like
I know one designer who basically had to design the same form 4 times over 2 years, and then work with a different developer each time to do the same thing. And yeah, that was
that's brutal. So Mike Haber asked an interesting question that I think might help us explore this a little bit further. The question was basically, does the word system and design system imply that the connections between those parts are as important as the parts themselves? So we talked about some parts, right? We talked about things like the fact that there's a user interface to the design system. Like it is design system is as a product, another way of phrasing that. We talked about what it's made of, like what the design system is actually like. Is it code? Is it rules? Is it colors? That kind of stuff. And then we talked about the fact that as a product itself, it needs to be versioned because it might evolve over time. And depending, the nasty thing about code is that you might write code 10 years ago that still needs to run without like an enormous amount of present investment. And so you have to support old versions of old design systems. That's a potential situation here. But these things themselves are related. Like David mentioned, guidelines versus systems. Like guidelines, that sounds like knowledge to me. It sounds like a list of words. Like do this, don't do that. Systems sound different to me. That sounds like parts and relationships. So I'm curious. I'm going to continue like kind of sketch mapping in a sort of way as like this discussion unfolds. But what makes a design system a system?
There are two ways that that's making me think. One is it necessarily involves people, processes, and technology. And I guess maybe those are the layers. You need to have enough people with enough connections between them in order to need to have processes in place so that those people have ways to work together well. And when there are enough processes that they need help getting those processes done, then the technology can help with automating some of that. Perhaps that's one way of thinking about it. The other thing that occurred to me was often, I think, where designers have started to think about design systems is Brad Frost's atomic design and the idea of like the atoms, just the single form field, but then you're combining that with other different atoms to create molecules and then bigger and bigger components. And then it's the connections between those things and the tension, the spacing between them and things like that that become more important.
I want to make sure that I capture all that, and I want to go back to the people, process, technology point there, because I think there's a way we can sharpen this, and it might be really, really, really interesting and useful. So I heard you say when there's a sufficient scale. So there's like let's say the component of a design system that you have to start from is an awareness of something about the people aspect. Let's sharpen that a bit. What about people in scale do we need to be aware of? Like I'm thinking literally like activities like monitoring the number of people contributing. Is that it? Like help me sharpen this a little bit. What's the tell that helps us know when a system?
Well, I'll add one thing is, and you can tell me if I'm off base here. But some things that like I've noticed would be just purely thinking from like a product designer role, right? Like when I'm designing an interface, not even thinking about like the experience layer or like interaction and like deeper stuff, but I have a bunch of decisions I have to make that take time and can be really fidgety, right? Like how long does it take to pick a typeface? Like that's like the change. How many designers does it take to change a light bulb question? Like how many years do I have, right? There can always be a better typeface, but if I'm working by myself, so let's say that I'm the only designer, and I'm sure we've all maybe experienced this. I have a lot. So I have to decide, okay, how big are the buttons? What typeface? What font size do I use? What is the spacing? Like these are like all pretty mundane questions, but you can really spin out on those a lot. And like once you get together an interface, you can be like, oh shit, like all of my spacing, all of my sizes looks terrible. It doesn't really fit right. It's not
And then you have
gelling.
to go back and change all of it.
All of the little stuff, like how much space, like how much padding do I need around like the button? How much margin do I need around a button? Like all of these things that like then may or may not be implemented the same way as the design, right? So like that's fine when I'm just working on my own thing and it can be fudged or like I can change it. But when I'm making those decisions and Ben, you're making those decisions and Tom, you're making those decisions and George too, and we're all working on teams within the same company. And you're like, well, button height should be like 40 pix. I know pix isn't the right measurement, but like, just go with me on this. And you're like, well, 35 is good. And then George is like, oh, we're on an 8-point system here. So like none of those really work.
Yeah. And I'm like, no, I want 80. I need a big
Right.
button.
Yeah. Like you want, and you're on the marketing team, right? So you're like, I need an 80 pix button. Like this needs to be like in your face. Being able to not necessarily remove those decisions, but to make those decisions less stressful or necessary as much as possible, right? Like you might say exactly like, oh, design system says these are our button sizes. And I noticed it only goes up to like 60 points, but I'm working on the marketing site and we need a giant call to action button. Like, what do I do here? Do I just multiply it by what we've kind of got? Or like you have all these like little decisions that like in the big picture of business kind of feel irrelevant to a lot of other folks. Like, who cares if it's like this hex of blue or that hex of blue? And like, how many shades of gray do you have? Like, by the way, how many shades of gray do you have is usually above 30, even if you don't believe it to be true. But these things like this drives developers crazy. It drives other designers crazy, like trying to like match colors, shades, like spacing, all of this stuff. And so there can be a feeling, like I've felt this too in the past, where like maybe your autonomy gets reduced a little bit by like what you're able to do and not do with the system. But if you're thinking at a scale of like, it starts getting funky at 2 people in my experience, but it's reconcilable if you are in communication with the other person.
And you get on.
Yeah, exactly. But when you start thinking about like, there's so many teams and people that you've never even met, like a third or even a half or even more of the teams that work at a company, you can't possibly reconcile those decisions. So I think like that's where the stuff starts to help in that respect. But I'm sure I'm missing out on all kinds of other things that systems help with.
I almost want to call it like social absorption. I don't know how to spell absorption. Of ambiguity or what is being resolved.
There's also, I think you are outsourcing some of your implicit guidance. So when it's just you and you're working on these things, you have a sense. You just have your designer's sense for, well, it's that much space and it's that big and that's fine. And then when someone else is working, they've got a different one. So you have to then have an explicit conversation about your implicit guidance and get that down codified somehow. And it could be useful, I think, what you're saying, David. I like where that's going. It can be useful to like make that for yourself to support your own work. But I think you make a great point. It becomes vital when you're trying to work with someone else.
Well, one thing you unpicked as well is that, which I haven't considered, is that once you bring in other functions that may have completely different needs for the work, that the design system itself, you almost need to, there's an interplay between how much fidelity you have in the system and how deep you go into it, and how like kind of like you lock some of the decisions versus, as you go far out, you kind of like need to also unlock the system as much as possible. Like if marketing needs big buttons and you don't allow big buttons, then if you want to take it to marketing, it's kind of like even thinking in demand space, it's like if they need something and you give them something that doesn't satisfy that, they're not going to use it or they're going to complain about it. So you might as well just expand it out or maybe branch it out completely. And so
Mark, that's complain about product designers, surely not.
No, I was thinking more marketing people would complain. Yeah, but yeah, that's a tough one for us, because we, like branching out something, you immediately start drifting away from coherence and consistency, because then you say, well, someone branched away and they might be doing whatever they want with that system now. We don't know. So we kind of want to, not do it, but then you still want to do it because people have needs and you can't really express those needs in the current system. So there's always this like flexion.
Yeah, and it comes back to the sort of enabling versus controlling sort of
Yeah,
tension, I think, doesn't it?
ultimately, yeah.
And that ability to flex, yeah, it's good points.
Well, one thing you also mentioned, Tom, about the process, and I think that's something I don't know if we can explore this further at some point. You mentioned about like wireframing, or I think it was sketching. Ben, you mentioned that's something that it's a tough one for. So how do basically it goes at the question of like how do teams build products, and do they go ahead and start with like a paper sketch, and then they go and progress it all the way to the final product, or do they just jump into the high fidelity stuff right away? And if they do, then what happens if they do that? And also, how do they kind of like communicate with their engineers? Do they just, is it like a mini waterfall where they just hand over the Figma file and goodbye? Or is it more of like a collaborative experience where it's like, they're figuring it out together and maybe even talking to users at the same time, which is great. But those things, the process itself, that actually is very difficult to measure and notice, but it defines a lot of the ways that I think teams interact with the design system.
I think that is a really important place. I think that we can sort of wrap things up around the issue of making these implicit decisions more explicit is hard because like when you're two people and you're having a conversation and you're negotiating about how to style buttons or whatever, like that's the social absorption of ambiguity thing, and it like you make that decision, then you move on, right? But the more people you involve, the harder that gets, and the more ambiguity in the decisions themselves, the harder that gets. And so like there's something here around, shoot, you know what, Tom, I just lost my train of thought. I was so close.
You caught it off me.
Rescue
Sorry.
me. No, I don't know. It's just one of those things where with the decisions that we're making, it's exposing a lot of the decisions that haven't been made, right? Or haven't been I should say explicitly made, written down, etc. Like it's all the stuff that's it's socialized. It's not designed and deployed. It's negotiated implicitly and in our heads instead of written down and decided in a way that is concrete. And so when you map something like that, I mean, when you map a product, that stuff starts to come out, and it can hurt because there's a whole, like, it's like debt. It's like knowledge debt. It's decision debt. I don't know what the right words are. But design systems, in a weird way, are then a way to pay down that debt, right? Because you're saying these are decisions we need to make, and deployment of that as designer sense is like an interesting framing of that, I think.
Yeah, I think there was the one thing that George touched on, and what you're saying there really reminds me of this as well, which is the important difference between consistency and coherence. Because consistency tends to ignore context, and David, you touched on this as well, whereas coherence is about what works for what you need to do. And those are the conversations, I think. Yeah. So we've solved it. Design systems done.
All done.
Yeah, I didn't expect us to finish this today. I think it's a tough conversation, so I'll keep thinking about this. I'll keep tweeting at you probably to get some thoughts on some of the stuff. But this has been super helpful. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And for those of you watching later, or if those of you are in the chat right now, please find us on Twitter. You can sort of I'd say engage us in a furtherance of this conversation, because I think all we've done is open up more questions, and there are lots of ways that we missed important assumptions and so on. Writing about this kind of stuff is important, and George, I know that you've got an article which I think I posted in the chat backlog. It'll also be in the description of this video. It's titled "Build Snowmen." Wait, no, hold on. Place monuments where kids make snowmen, which sounds like a Christopher Alexander thing. I don't know if it is.
Yeah.
It is? Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds very, very much like him. So take a look at that, read that article, and engage us and ask further questions. Help us kind of think through this together. I'd like to do this again sometime, because design systems deserve, I think, the attention, the intention and attention. So with that, I wanted to say thank you, Tom. Thank you, George. Thank you, David, for helping us explore this together. what are you all up to? Where can folks find you besides the Twitter and things like that?
I'm usually on Twitter and LinkedIn a little bit. I'm still figuring out if I should be on LinkedIn, but that's pretty much it. And
I think everyone is figuring that out. Twitter is easy for me.
Excellent. And David, I know you're on Twitter as well. I'm on Twitter. We're all on Twitter.
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Yeah, you've been taking a social media break, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, find us on there. Hit us up. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, we should continue this conversation.
Thanks, Ben, for putting it together. And
thank you.
Live mapping.
Yeah, we should have more Wardley mapping conversations, I think, because the more examples of maps, the more examples of mapping that we can put out into the world, I think the more people will be able to say, hey, I can do this. So that's the goal of doing this kind of stuff. So any suggestions, topics, hit me up at Hired Thought on Twitter, Ben at hiredthought.com by email, although that's slower sometimes. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you around next time.